charge of the Special Local History Collection and Archives Unit of the Beaufort County Library. Upon occasion, the mission of the Pat Conroy Literary Center and the Beaufort District Collection meet up. Today's event is one of those very happy occasions. So welcome to this special presentation on Ann Head, as presented by her daughters Nancy Thode and Stacy Honor. This program is part of the South Carolina Academy of Authors Induction Weekend here in Beaufort, hosted by the Pat Conroy Literary Center and others, including our Beaufort County Library. Tomorrow night, 4 authors will be inducted into the Palmetto State's Literary Hall of Fame: Ann Head, William P. Baldwin, Harlan Green, and Marcus Amaker. And most of you do not know that Harlan Green was one of my mentors when I came into this field 25 years ago. So thank you to all of the Academy of Author board members and Conroy Center volunteers who are with us this afternoon. As inductee Marcus Amaker is unable to be with us in person, we are honoring him throughout the weekend by beginning each author program with a short reading from his work. Reading for us this afternoon will be poet Tim Conroy, who said, "I'm supposed to say, 'Hey you, it's your turn,' after which I'll be back to introduce our speakers."
It's my pleasure to be here today. Ann Head to me is mythical. When I look at her photographs, I see what must have been the coolest, most sophisticated person in Beaufort County when she was here. And I can imagine, because I'm a descendant of the great Santini, and so was Pat, and we're the most unsophisticated people alive in our genes, I can imagine Pat just latched on to her. For all the wisdom and art and creativity that he could derive from her. So my pleasure to read this poem by Marcus. Marcus is also one of the coolest people around. So, he is one of those people you imagine in a jazz club reading his poetry. So I'm not going to do it justice, but I'm going to try. This is a poem from his collection Empath, and the poem is titled "The Last Word." One day, someone will write the last poem about injustice, and it will become our new national anthem. Only history books will hold the memory of hatred, and museums will be built for the artifacts of our awakening. One day, someone will have the last conversation about politics because we realized there were problems that our politicians couldn't fix. Policies not built to cure our addiction to division. No governing body that compared to the bodies of the enlightened. One day, this poem won't be a manifesto for dreamers. We will wake up from nightmares of our own making and reject our attraction to darkness, our love affair with conflict. One day. Thank you.
I'm back. Nancy Head Thode wears many hats: community volunteer, family psychotherapist, actress and writer and performer of one-woman shows, biographer of her mother Ann Head. Her most valued hat being that of mother to Anne Everly and John Everly, and grandmother to Nora, Eva, Declan, Colin, and Rose. She splits her time between Connecticut and her beloved Frith Island. Her sister, Stacy, is the first woman commissioned into the military from William and Mary College. A Russian linguist, she served in intelligence for 20 years and thence was a fundraiser at schools and universities. She is currently at Virginia Tech College of Veterinary Medicine. She and her husband are empty nesters with 2 wonderful grown daughters. We are honored to learn more about the legacy and life of Beaufort's forgotten novelist Anne Head from those who knew her best, her accomplished daughters, and to say no more than that, in this introduction might be considered spoilers. So please, let's welcome Nancy and Stacy.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and it's nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Anyway, I will say I'm Nancy Thody.
And I am her sister, Stacy Honor.
Well, Stacy and I grew up in Beaufort, and we always love coming back here. It means a lot to have this chance to tell the story of our mother, Beaufort writer Anne Head.
Before we start, I need to note that this work on bringing Anne Head out of darkness has occurred solely because of Nancy's determination, talent, and great love for our mother. This originally was her presentation, and typical of her generosity, she wanted me to share it with her. Along with Mother's writing, we both feel that our being one another's best friend is the best gift our mother could have given us.
So we thank you, the South Carolina Academy of Authors, the Beaufort Library, and the Pat Conroy Literary Center for making this possible. Stacy and I will each tell stories from our time, more or less. Now, before we start, let me see a show of hands. How many people in this room grew up in Beaufort? Wow, okay. That's a good showing. And before you read about this talk or about this weekend, how many people in this room, excluding family members, had heard of Anne Head? Wow. Let me tell you, that is a very different story from 5 years ago. That's very rewarding to see. A large show of hands. Now, let me ask you again, how many people in this room have heard of Pat Conroy? Well, Anne Head was Pat's first writing teacher. She was his mentor and confidant. In Pat's autobiography, entitled Cookbook, he wrote a chapter called My First Novelist. He wrote, excuse me, she was the first novelist I ever met in the flesh. She looked like a woman who would not tolerate a preposition at the end of a sentence or the anarchy of a dangling participle. She required my adjectives to actually mean something when I landed them into one of my overloaded paragraphs. And in his book, My Reading Life, Pat writes about the letters she sent him during his freshman year at the Citadel. Quote, "She also told me to remember everything I could about my plebe year at the Citadel. She thought it would make a fine novel one day." When Pat met Mama, it was as though she was a different planet. He was a teenager at Beaufort High School, and she was a published novelist. And even though she lived in Beaufort, she was not of Beaufort. No, stay at home, know your place kind of lady. She marched to her own drummer. She smoked cigarettes from a Dunhill cigarette holder while reading the latest copy of the New Yorker. She gave elaborate cocktail parties. She played classical music incessantly. She wore large brimmed hats. With her pure white hair, she stood out, to put it mildly. When I was in elementary school, she embarrassed me. Kids don't want their parents to stand out. But when I recently asked friends that I grew up with what they thought of her back then, they say things like, she was sophisticated. She listened to us as though we were adults. She had an air of self-confidence. She exposed us to the idea that there was more to life than the sleepy little town we were living in. Ann Head was a living example that more was possible. But the reality is she really was of Beaufort. She was rooted here. Mama's grandmother, Abby, came down to Beaufort from Massachusetts during the Civil War to teach and work with the freed slaves. And boy, was Abby a powerhouse. Our great-grandmother, Abby, was the first to collect and publish the Uncle Remus stories long before Joel Chandler Harris. She started the first Montessori school in South Carolina, a heritage that was taken up 100 years later by another of Abby's great-granddaughters, Anne Christensen Politzer, who's here with us today. She also started a Montessori school in Beaufort. A biography of Abby was published a few years back, Cultivating a New South, Abby Holmes Christensen, The Politics of Race and Gender. So Mama had radical ideas and writing in her bloodline. Now, great-grandmama Abby married Captain Niels Christensen in 1875. Niels was a newly arrived immigrant from Denmark. He could read and write, so they made him a captain in the Union Army. And he was put in charge of an African-American company. Later, he was sent to Beaufort to establish the Federal Cemetery. And if you haven't been over to the Federal Cemetery on Boundary Street, you really should go. Landscaping that Captain Christensen planted is gorgeous. He also, Captain Christensen, raised peacocks. So Abby one day came to the cemetery to admire the peacocks, and Niels admired Abby. And as these things go, they married and moved into a big antebellum house on the point. It's still there, right at the end of Washington Street, down from the USCB Center for the Arts. Abby and Niels had 6 children. The oldest was Niels Jr., my grandfather and Mama's father. They lived in Beaufort, but Abby and the children were constantly back and forth between Beaufort and Boston. Abby took the children up to Boston to go to school after they finished Montessori. She had 1 foot in Beaufort and 1 foot in New England, always. Now, Captain Christensen had married a Bostonian, and Niels Jr. followed in his footsteps. He married Catherine Whale Stratton, who, by the way, was always called Nancy. We have no idea why, but that's how I got my name. Our grandmother Nancy was a upper-crust Boston Brahmin who lived on the prestigious Beacon Street and was in the Blue Book Social Register. She traced her ancestors back to Benjamin Franklin and was never allowed outside unchaperoned until she was 28 years old. Then she was spirited down to Beaufort by her new husband Niels, and boy, did she love her freedom. She could roam the streets and rivers of Beaufort at will. They moved into a house at 310 Federal Street on the point, just a few blocks from the Washington Street family home. Now, we've all heard stories about life in Beaufort back then, and some things about life in Beaufort never changed. They may just be the same today. Maybe you've had some of the same experiences we had. Playing and sailing in the rivers and bogging in the mud and grabbing hold of marsh grass to pull yourself along, crabbing off docks with a sinker and a chicken neck tied to a string. Our family likes to tell the story about Nancy and her best friend, Eulie Mae Sally. Eulie Mae lived at the end of Pigeon Point, and Nancy and Eulie Mae would go into the river at Nancy's house on Federal Street, encased in their inner tubes and wearing large brimmed straw hats, and float on the incoming tide around to Pigeon Point. And then, if they timed it just right, they would reverse direction and float back to Nancy's house on the outgoing tide, chatting all the way, their voices carrying it easily across the water to the delight of those on the shore who could hear all the latest Beaufort gossip. Now, Nancy and Niels had 4 children. Niels the third, then Mama, then Stratton and Andrea. Andrea came along last and too late for that photo. Number 2, our mother, Ann Wales Christensen, was born at home on October 30th, 1915. She grew up in Beaufort. Her roots were in Beaufort. But, following family tradition, she was back and forth between Beaufort and Boston all through her childhood, from time to time living with the very proper grandmother Stratton and on Beacon Hill and going to the Boston schools. She remembered having tea with her grandmother every afternoon and sitting on a backless stool because it was good for her posture. Back and forth between Beaufort and Boston schools, she graduated from the Cambridge School in Boston at age 18 and then went off to Antioch College in Springfield, Ohio. Now, just as an aside, her younger brother Stratton was the youngest person ever elected to the South Carolina legislature. He had graduated from Harvard in 1940 and ran for the legislature, and much to everyone's surprise, he won. But soon he decided to join the Navy, following in his classmate Jack Kennedy's footsteps. Stratton was lost at sea. The Navy's converted yacht on which he was stationed sunk by a German submarine. There's a gravestone in his honor at the Federal Cemetery in Beaufort. Now, speaking of his friend Jack Kennedy, there's a rather interesting story in my family's history involving Jack and our very straight-laced Boston great-grandmother, which I'm going to just share in my biography. I don't want to give away too much. I want you to buy the book. But they were pretty snobby, these Boston Brahmins. Mama told me when she was a young girl in school in Boston and wanted to bring a friend home to the Beacon Street house, Grandmother Stratton thumbed through the blue book to make sure the friend was listed before she was allowed to visit. Mama herself befriended all kinds of people, regardless of background, creed, or race, and a lot of her stories explore class distinctions and the problems they cause. Now, by the time Stratton was killed, Mama's parents had died, her mother of cancer at 52. 52. It was a tragedy. Anne was only 22, and her father died in an automobile accident a year later. But several months after the death of her mother, Mama had married. After a whirlwind courtship, a man no one in Beaufort had ever heard of. Excuse me. I've got a frog in my throat. Beaufort weather. Have you ever heard of Howard Head? Today you probably have if you're a skier or a tennis player. Well, when they were married, Howard wanted to be a writer, just like Mama, but soon it became apparent he was getting nowhere. So Mama was the one that suggested that he take an aptitude test. And surprise, surprise, the test showed he was terrible at writing and great at engineering skills. So I would like to give Mama credit, some credit, for what happened next. My daddy went on to become an engineer and in time invented the first metal snow ski, the Head, and then later the first oversized tennis racket, the Prince. He had found his niche. However, long before these inventions came to pass, he found he did not want to be married to Anne. This was back in 1944, and divorce was scandalous. I mean, it had only been a few years since divorcee Wallace Simpson had upended the British Empire. South Carolina didn't even recognize divorce until 1948. But they were living in Baltimore, so they got a divorce there. Now, by this time, Anne had been writing nonstop for the 5 years she'd been married to Daddy. lots of short stories, and even a play. I know her work was selling before the divorce. She refused alimony and child support. She was making more money than he was. She sold her first story in 1943 at the age of 28, and in 1945, 8 short stories appeared in McCall's and Cosmopolitan. She was on a roll. Now, after they separated, Mama moved back to her haven, Beaufort, with me, age 3, and our dog, Dolly. We moved in with Aunt Helen Christensen in the family home at the end of Washington Street, and then into an apartment on Federal Street, right next door to the house Mama had grown up in, which was lucky for me because I became best friends with Betty Kinghorn, who lived practically next door, who just happens to be here today. My mama worked hard at her writing. She blocked out hours every day, determined to write at least 3 pages, double-spaced, always on yellow paper. I can see her sitting at her typewriter with rubber tips on her fingers. This was way before electric typewriters, and you had to pound the keys really hard. And always playing music, opera. Before Samuel Hopkins Adams told her she must not play opera while she's writing, because how could she write words when she's listening to words? So she switched to symphonies. Her diaries and notebooks from the 40s and 50s give us hints about how she taught herself writing. She'd collect character vignettes and quotes about writing from other authors and newspaper clippings that had the gem of a story idea. She wrote several articles for the journal The Writer, which give us a little window into her process. She wrote that the germ of her story writing began, she believed, when as a child she would play endlessly with paper dolls and create elaborate stories about their lives. The dolls would live in houses on the floor of her bedroom made out of old checkbook covers, and she would make up elaborate stories about the lives of the paper dolls, stories that would go on for months and months. In another article entitled, "Where Do You Get Your Ideas?" she describes her struggle with the process of writing. She finally figured out that ideas were something you dreamed up, and work was what you did to them. As an example, she writes, "A woman is sitting on a train. She doesn't like where she's going. That's all. I wrote a sentence, meaningless to me then, and then with no associations, past or future, in my mind. I wrote it just to be pounding the keys. Then I read the sentence, and I asked myself, well, where is she going, and what is she going to do about it when she gets there?" I asked myself these questions, and as I asked them, I wrote down the answers. And as I answered these questions, a person evolved. And as she evolved, a situation evolved around her. The plot, the idea. Why didn't she like where she was going? Well, because she was going to go visit the parents of her husband who had been killed overseas, and she never met them. But that was no story, that was a fact. Well, the truth of the matter is that she didn't love her husband, and the only reason she was going to visit his parents is because they begged her to. As Mama writes in the article, she goes on to describe the plot as it evolves step by step as she gets to better know the characters and answer more questions about them. She didn't believe that she had some innate talent or ideas. She just knew she wanted to write. And what she did believe was that anyone who really wanted to write could write, if they were willing to do the grueling work of writing. Now, this article was published in December of 1946, just as her first stories are being published. But it gives us a window into her process as she began. For years, she called herself a hack writer. She even told Pat Conroy, she said, "I'm not a very good writer." A hack writer wasn't a bad thing. A hack writer was someone who wrote for money. And my mama wrote for money. She had to support us. So she wrote what would sell. When I was 5 and 6 and 7, she rented a basement room down the block on Federal Street, no doubt to escape from me. I remember riding my bike by the house and around the block and screaming every time I would get to the apartment at the top of my lungs. I think I must have driven her crazy, which was the idea. Many years later, she rented an office in a tiny house on Church Street that had once been the kitchen for a large antebellum Beaufort home. It's still there. She was successful. Her work was compelling. She published over 50 stories, many set in a town like Beaufort. They were published in dozens of magazines: Saturday Evening Post, McCall's, Red Book, Ladies' Home Journal, Cosmopolitan, Collier's. Remember Collier's? Women's magazine fiction back then was mostly about good girl, bad girl dynamics, or conversely, Leave It to Beaver stories. But Mama's stories poked at the edges. She wrote about divorce and snobbery, emotional affairs, sexual affairs. She wrote about prejudice, death, out of wedlock childbirth. She went for the non-typical heroines. Her stories were popular, and she got lots of fan mail from all over the country and abroad. But it was not an easy life. Mama was constantly worried about running out of money before the next story would sell. I felt like we were financial partners when I was a kid. When a story sold, we'd celebrate and eat steak and buy new clothes. When nothing sold, I'd make brownies and sell them door to door and take a cut in my 50 cents allowance. We'd buy shrimp off the shrimp boat for 25 cents a bucket and wear last year's clothes. One year we even had to go live with relatives. But that year she pulled it together and determined to write a story a week, enough to support us. Back to Beaufort we came. She rented a little house on the bluff on Rebo Road, overlooking the Beaufort River. She loved that house. In 1950, she wrote to a friend, "It's the most heavenly spot anyone could choose. Really breathtaking when the wind and tide are high on a moonlit night. Even when it rains, there's a stage-set atmosphere, Macbethian, heavy mist, hanging behind the pine trees off the edge of the bluff, as though if you took one step beyond the grass's edge, you'd drop off into eternity and not mind a bit." Well, her plan worked. The dry spell ended. 3 stories were published in 1950, 2 more in 51, 2 in 52, 5 in 53. She was on a roll. Now, I mentioned that sometimes when I was a kid, I found my mother embarrassing, but I'll tell you what I was proud of was her stance on integration, women's rights, and the Vietnam War. For her time and in her way, she embraced the African Americans of Beaufort. And Mama had friends across all religions. Her best friend was the very liberal Harriet Keisling, who was one of the first women elected to the South Carolina legislature. They talked politics and racial issues while playing long games of Scrabble, sitting on Mama's bed. Cooperative Scrabble. Do you know what cooperative Scrabble is? The idea was to place the words for the good of the board, so that at the end of the game they would get the highest joint score. Aggressive, right? Now, she wasn't making ends meet. She was making a name for herself, Beaufort's only full-time living novelist. She was revered and respected. Fan mail poured in from all over the country. She got to know many of the part-time Beaufort authors: Somerset Maugham, John Marquand, Catherine and E.B. White. Samuel Hopkins Adams became her mentor. Elizabeth Boatwright Coker and Mama wrote to each other frequently about their writing. I tell more about her relationships with well-known writers in the upcoming biography, including how she came to entertain John Marquand, who had won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, the late George Apley, in her boudoir, dressed in her most glamorous bedclothes. As for Somerset Maugham, I know they met, but other than that, I don't know what the connection was. I have a letter acknowledging that Mama donated some Somerset Maugham memorabilia to the Beaufort Library. I have no idea what it was, and whatever it was has disappeared. Were they letters, signed books? It's a mystery. But let me tell you, there are many mysteries in Mama's life. The more I work on her biography, the more I discover. The most memorable Beaufort writer came into her life when he was a teenager, Pat Conroy. This was in the 1960s, and Mama had moved on from short stories and magazines to publishing books, each of them completely different. Fair with Rain was set in South Carolina, told the story of the Blair family with warmth, pathos, and humor. The Blairs were reviewed as one of the most attractive families in American fiction. Then came Always in August, a Gothic mystery set in a town very much like Beaufort. Then Everyone Adored Kara, a murder mystery set in New England. And now, before I go on, I'm going to ask another question. Has anyone in this room heard of Gene Norris? Okay. He was an English teacher, as you know, at Beaufort High School. He called Mama one day. Would you be willing to teach a writing class at the Beaufort High School to a small group of English students? Absolutely no. Mama was terrified of public speaking. She avoided book signings whenever she could. Mama was brave in many ways, but she had her share of fears. Bridges, tunnels, elevators, flying, and especially public speaking. It will be a small class. You can make a difference in their lives. Finally, Jean wore her down, and she agreed. The rest is literary history. Pat Conroy was in that class of 5 students and was thrilled to be in the presence of a real writer. They became good friends, he her eager student and she his mentor and confidant. He spent afternoons at her house absorbing all he could about Mama and the world of a writer. She was an oasis for Pat, someone who appreciated him and his talent. After he left for the Citadel, he wrote letters to her, beginning with his over-the-top prose. My darling Mrs. Morris. She had remarried by this time. Or most passionately beloved Mrs. Morris. Full of affection and outlining the traumas of freshman life at the Citadel, as well as keeping her up to date on his reading and love life. Their correspondence is priceless. Let me read you a few excerpts taken from the numerous letters that will be included in the biography. This is a letter written in November of 1963. Dear Mrs. Morris, the poems have been published, and one of them nearly a preamble to my obituary. He then copies longhand into the letter his first published poem entitled To Thomas Wolfe. And in his letter he goes on, when the upperclassmen read this, they were at last a little more kindly disposed to Cadet Private D.P. Conroy. Then their eyes shifted downward where a poem of lesser stature met them. Yes, met them. The dreams of youth are pleasant dreams of women, vintage, and the sea. Last night I dreamt I was a dog who found an upperclassman tree. The letter continues. I was getting ready for noon formation when I looked toward my door. My roommates froze with fear. I was etched in doom. Milling out there were about 1 million, yes, 100 million members of the upper classes. It was a lynch mob, hatred shone round about them, and I feared exceedingly. The words had been softened for you, Mrs. Morris. Conroy, do you wish to urinate on me? Conroy, you not only found a tree, you found a forest. I found a smackhead tree. This will cost you some push-ups, Conroy. I was scared that day, Mrs. Morris, but the result is they like me a little better. My love is with you always. My hopes that you will write soon are soaring high. Love and passion, Patrick. Mama responds, Dear Pat, how grand that you had 2 poems make the literary magazine. I'm terribly impressed. Please send copies of the poem even if you can't wrangle me the entire magazine. I'm also delighted you struck oil in your English professor. Stop feeling sorry for yourself on the educational level. Nobody nor any institution gives you an education. If you want it bad enough, you take it where you find it. And in the end, like love or religion, it's what you do with it that counts. And so endeth the first lesson. End of quote. She was always trying to fix him up with daughters of her friends. Quote, I wrote to Molly the other day. I told her that you were a most respectable, upright, and highly commendable young man. It was not my intention to damn with faint praise. That is all I told her about you. I did not tell her that you were also charming, intelligent, talented, bawdy, outspoken, agnostic, and love-starved. I felt these things are every girl's privilege to find out for herself, or not find out, which is your privilege. In haste, affectionately, Mrs. M. Around 1998, long after Mama had died, Pat came over to my house on Fripp Island and talked to me, actually regaled me about his love for Mama, his teacher. A few weeks later, I got an envelope from Pat. Enclosed were a couple of the letters Mom had written to him and a story he'd written in her class. At the top of the page, Pat wrote, Dear Nancy, I wrote this in your mother's class. Why she thought I had a smidgen of talent remains a mystery. Pat Conroy. It's actually a quite charming story and appended to the Ann Head biography. I like to think that evening in my living room on Fripp Island played some part in Pat's decision to write about Mama. His autobiographical book, Cookbook, was published a few years later, included the chapter about his beloved mentor. Every time Pat Conroy sold a book, he said he put a rose on her grave. Well, if you think Pat Conroy had a shocking life, upending tradition at the Citadel, struggling through relationships until he met his adored Cassandra, that is nothing compared to the shocking life Mama led. I have to backtrack a little bit to explain. Remember those mysteries she wrote? The mystery story I'm now going to tell you a little about is probably Mama's most compelling work of fiction. In July of 1954, I was 12, almost 13, and Mama said, Nancy, I've been asked to come to New York for 5 months and write for television. We'll be home in time for Christmas. You'll live with your aunt and uncle in Philadelphia, and you'll spend weekends with me, okay? Stories of fiction were the stuff of life for Mama. We took the train from Yemassee, and we stopped off in Camp Lejeune to spend the night with friends. This is where I heard the real story. It was hot and the air was heavy that August night. We sat on the back steps of the house in the dark, hoping to catch a breeze and listening to the night sounds of the cicadas. Mama took a deep breath. Nancy, I'm going to have a baby. You're going to have a baby brother or sister. I said, who's the daddy? I can't tell you that, she said. It's a secret. And it's a secret I'm having a baby. And of course, the biggest secret was that she'd been having an affair with a married man for years. All right, just think about it. Mid-1950s, small southern town, out of wedlock pregnancy, a Peyton Place scandal in the making. You mustn't tell anyone in Beaufort, but I promise you, once the baby is born, we will go back to Beaufort and I will find a way to have that baby come live with us. Well, the plot she devised to achieve that goal could have been one of her novels in one of the magazines of the day. She rented a house in Princeton, New Jersey. I moved in with my aunt and uncle and visited on weekends. 4 months later, my sister Stacy was born on Saturday, December 11th, 1954. Several days later, Mama brought her to Philadelphia, and along with my aunt and uncle, I met them in a hotel room. A few minutes later, a nurse, dressed in a starch white uniform, came into the room. As had been elaborately planned, she gathered Stacy up and left. Mama was sobbing, and I didn't know what to think. But that was all part of the plan. Mama and I took the train back to Beaufort. How Stacy, at 6 weeks old, came to live with us, a foundling being adopted by Mama, is the stuff of fiction. Mama's specialty. The plan was elaborate, the execution flawless. And now, here she is.
Wonderful. Before continuing with my part of the story, I want to pause for a moment and reflect on the impact of all of this on my then 13-year-old sister. Her almost 40-year-old single mother pulls her out of school in Beaufort, tells her a secret that she is having a baby, and puts Nancy in school in Philadelphia, not very different from Beaufort, with her cousins. Most amazing, once back in Beaufort, Nancy kept the secret. I wouldn't have. The minute my feet touched Beaufort soil, everyone would have known. I used to ask her if she resented me for taking up a lot of Mother's attention. She has always answered that she could not have been happier to share the intense focus of our mother. My arrival was apparently very freeing for her, and we immediately formed a close bond. I adored and worshipped her then, and continue to do so now. But back to the story. When I was 3 in 1957, my parents married. My father, Dr. Stan Morse, finalized his divorce, moved into the house on the bluff, and Nancy went off to Ashley Hall boarding school. I was not happy with either of these changes and gave Dad about 2 days before bringing him his slippers and saying, "Here, Dada, I'll help you pack." It didn't create the change I was hoping for. Ultimately, Mother, Dad, and I settled into Dad's house on Battery Creek. It's a spacious home, the yard filled with ancient live oaks, dripping with Spanish moss, and sloping down to beautiful wide Battery Creek. It was the best playground imaginable. Dad had an early heart attack in his 40s and began gardening as therapy. He planted acres of zinnias, camellias, and azaleas, dahlias, and gladiolas. He and I would walk the yard before breakfast, and he would always return with fresh-cut flowers for Mother. Mother's hobby was cooking, and she was very good at it, and now at last she had a husband to cook for her. They were social, entertaining at dinner parties or bridge get-togethers, and going out to parties at least once a week. We traveled to Hilton Head for getaway weekends, and Nancy would come home to the Battery Creek house for vacations and summer holidays, my favorite times. In some ways, I had a different mother from Nancy. Mine was married to a respected, much adored family doctor, which gave her a new level of respectability. She lived in a lovely home that they owned. Mother now had, for the first time in her adult life, a measure of financial security. She no longer had to sell, sell, sell. Her talent could blossom. She even tried her hand at poetry. Published in 1965 in Requiem for a Bachelor, a group of women discuss and bemoan the marriage of the man they had all been in love with and counted on to be the always available extra man. It's a long poem. Here are a few lines. I'll miss him as an extra man, the charming knave who could be counted upon for the sort of attention one doesn't dare mention to husbands. He made you feel intensely real and dangerously charming. It was, she sighed, most disarming. Requiem for a Bachelor was published in McCall's magazine and in a number of countries, including Australia. But my favorite poem of hers about the neglected child of a struggling single mother was never published and starts with the lines, "The pride of the children a silence keeps. They carry their secrets in their eyes. Ask me no questions, and I'll tell you no lies." As was the case with Nancy, my mother was different from the other mothers. Mine was older, famous, very serious about her work, and unlike most mothers, did not take time off for any of my events that fell within her workday. There was once, though, that she made an exception. When the Beaufort schools integrated, starting with maybe 3 black kids in each school, a wonderful experience for them, I'm sure, one girl, Lucy Brown, was put in my 5th grade class, in part because the principal knew that Mother would be supportive. That year, Mother came to Parents' Day for the first and last time. Lucy was on her own, so Mother immediately had her pair with us. Mother had a lot of serious phobias and fears, but she also had a fierce sense of personal ethics and political convictions. Lucy and I went into the lunch line with her, came out with our trays, and looked around for a place to sit in the midst of an unfriendly room. Mother spotted 3 seats, led us to the table, put her tray down firmly, and smiled warmly at our new friends. She got some grudging hellos, and no one left the table. I was and am so proud of her. My father, though not especially supportive of her liberalism, was very supportive of her writing and of her decision to do some volunteer teaching at Beaufort High. I probably would have been oblivious to her volunteering if it were not for hearing Mom tell Dad about this amazing kid, Pat, in her class while reading to him part of Pat's initial essay. At age 7, I knew, thanks to Mother's encouragement, that I was a very fine writer. But I also knew that I had never heard my mother speak of my talent with that level of delight and awe. Instantly, I hated this Pat guy, who even came to our house to work with Mother. However, his charm extended to children, and I grew to like him in spite of my green monster. Another of Mother's courageous moments was when she went to the Conroy home, catalog from Antioch College in hand, and tried to convince his father to send him there rather than to the Citadel. The great Santini threw the catalog across the room and invited Mother to leave. In retrospect, it is somewhat ironic to realize that our mother was living with her own Santini. My father's temper, fueled by alcohol, mainly came out at night. I saw him as 2 people, daytime Dad and evening Dad. As much as Mother loved him, and as good as they were for each other in many ways, this volatility took an immense toll on her and on me. Nevertheless, she continued to turn out wonderful work, most importantly, her crowning achievement. She wrote her best-known book, Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones, about a teen marriage in 1964. It was not published until 1967 because many of her publishers felt it was too risque. This is not the kind of story your fans expect. While it was being shopped around, some of her friends were dealing with their own pregnant teenagers and confiding in her. She said at the time she wanted to tell them to stop, as they would think she was telling their story. When the book actually came out, one of her closest friends felt betrayed and did not speak to her for months. In actuality, the school has some similarity to hers. In the case of Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones, two teenagers struggle with an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. I'm not going to be a spoiler and tell you how it ends in case you haven't read it, but the book was her biggest success. Her other books sold well in many editions in different countries and different languages, but Bojo Jones was on an entirely different level. Adults and teenagers both could relate to it. For 50 years, it was on school reading lists. It has been credited with starting the young adult literary genre. And now she was being courted by Samuel Goldwyn Jr. to go to Hollywood to write the screenplay. As exciting as it was, this was also very stressful. The decision of whether to go to California, to fly, which she had never done, and leave me with my father was not an easy one. In a poem about her sister, Andrea Rawson captured this fraught period. She wrote in part, Samuel Goldwyn Jr. called from Hollywood. They would be filming Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones. Would she come out and do the screenplay? Leave her family? Fly to the coast? Reaching with shaking fingers for her pill? Impossible. Then, one fragrant spring night, eagerly anticipating her first grandchild, she was felled by an aneurysm, a stroke, leaving us stunned by a door suddenly slammed shut. Mother died in the middle of these negotiations, suddenly and tragically at the age of 52, from a cerebral hemorrhage. I was 13. Her death shocked her family, Beaufort, and her far-flung friends. She was so vibrant and charismatic, it just did not seem real. Sam Goldwyn called Dad to tell him they could not do a feature movie without Mother's help. Someone else wrote the screenplay. Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones was made into a movie for television, starring Desi Arnaz Jr. She would not have approved of the script, let me tell you. Read the book. It's still being read today. Reviews on Amazon are glowing. It was cited numerous times on Google as well as in Wikipedia. It was published in many countries. The book, as well as the movie, continues to sell well today. Nancy's and my mother, Ann Head, Anne Wales Christensen Head Morse, died in 1968. Her work lives on, but she faded from memory in her hometown of Beaufort. Well, not completely. There are those who have tracked her down. There was a University of South Carolina student, Carol Wyatt, who wrote a paper about Ann Head in 1991. David Lauderdale wrote a wonderful newspaper article about her in 2015, and again in his chapter in the book, Our Prince of Scribes, which he titled Pat Conroy's First Novelist and Final Homecoming. And of course, Pat Conroy wrote a chapter about her in his autobiography and cited her in other books. Harriet Kaiserling wrote of their special friendship in her book, Against the Tide. Larry Rowland mentions her in his History of Beaufort. A book group that focuses on short stories read one of Ann Head's stories and commented on how relevant the story was to relationships of today. and we have tons and tons of her fan mail. So perhaps her legacy hadn't died after all.
Thank you, Stacey. About 4 years ago, I got a mysterious letter that had gone through several different addresses before finding me. It said, "Dear Mrs. Thody, as an archivist and novelist and literary historian, I just wanted you to know how much I admire your mother's work." The letter goes on to inquire whether there existed papers documenting her work. Well, I had bins and bins of her letters, manuscripts, and published stories in my storeroom in Connecticut. Stacy had rescued them after the death of her father and stepmother and given them to me for safekeeping. We hadn't had a clue what to do with them. So I met with the writer of the letter, Harlan Green, the archivist at the College of Charleston, and a well-known lecturer and author himself. After he heard Mama's story, he said, "You really should write her biography." That was interesting. Well, then I met Jonathan Haupt at the Pat Conroy Literary Center, and he encouraged me to write our mother's story too. So here we are. Step 1. Step 2. For the last 5 years, I've worked with the English department at the Beaufort High School. Wendy Lacombe the first 4 years, and this year Michael Gaudier, to sponsor the Anne Head Prize for Short Story Fiction. The Beaufort High School English department and a group of judges from Anne Head's family review as many as 30 submissions every year. So many talented young writers make it a tough job. I would also like to now introduce the winner of this year's prize, the Anne Head Literary Prize for Short Story Fiction, Rebecca Thompson. I think she's here today. Would you stand, Rebecca? Please stand and take a bow. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here today, too. I'd also like to give a shout out to Susan Diamond Riley, who volunteered for the last 2 years to give an editing workshop to the contestants at the Beaufort High School. I don't know if Susan's here today. Hi, would you stand? Hello, yay. Thank you, Susan. And to Jonathan Haupt, who tirelessly supports all of my efforts on the behalf of Anne Head. Now, most of all, it's been such a pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce our mother, the writer Anne Head, to you. And I have to tell you, it's just the beginning. Look for the upcoming biography. Better yet, give us your email and name and we'll let you know when it comes out. In the meantime, if you're curious, her stories and books are all available at the Beaufort Library Archives, thanks to Grace Cordial, who has archived them all. There are a few members of Anne Head's family here today. If you're related to Anne Christensen Head Morris, would you please stand? And everyone, So thank you to Grace Cordial and the Beaufort Library and to the South Carolina Academy of Authors and to Jonathan Haupt and the Pat Conroy Literary Center for sponsoring this talk today. And I thank you all for listening. Before we end, I'll just ask you, is there anyone who has any memories of Anne they'd like to share today? Or is there anyone who has any questions for us? If not, I'll just say thank you so much for coming. I look. Thank you.